Man drives 200 miles to kill a man he thought was dating his ex. It's wrong all the way around.
May 4th, 2020 is the day an innocent young man lost his life simply because he fit into the description of a black man with locks in his hair. It was a calm spring morning in Arlington, Texas. People were going about their usual activities, some heading to work, others enjoying a peaceful day at home. Then, before anyone could say jack, a young man was lying lifeless in the parking lot. By the time the police arrived at the quiet apartment complex, he was identified as Robert Cooley III, a talented musician and beloved son. But his death wasn't a random act of violence, because earlier that day, a man drove over 250 miles from Houston with one goal: to take the life of another man, but ended up killing the wrong person instead. What could push someone to do such a thing? Welcome, let's take you through the horrifying story of Kendall Morris. On a sunny morning in May 2020, life seemed normal at the Barden Green apartment complex in Arlington, Texas. Neighbors greeted each other with casual smiles, unaware that tragedy was just moments away. Robert Cooley III, a 24-year-old artist and athlete with big dreams, was walking through the parking lot. To his family and friends, Robert was a light, a young man filled with talent, ambition, and a warm heart. But that morning, he would become the victim of a sad and senseless crime. Miles away in Houston, a different storm was brewing. Kendall Gerald Morris, a 26-year-old father, was consumed by rage and jealousy. For weeks, he had been in bitter arguments with the new boyfriend of his child's mother. The man lived in Arlington, and the tension between the two men had reached a boiling point. Morris decided that words were no longer enough. Accompanied by a friend, Morris made the fateful decision to drive over 250 miles from Houston to Arlington. The only thing guiding him was anger and a vague description. The boyfriend was a black man with dreadlocks. Morris had never met the man, didn't know his face, and didn't even know his name. But in his mind, he had a target. Before the drive, Morris earlier had a phone conversation with the real target, and the call ended in deadlock, which presumably aggravated him to the Arlington murder. The journey itself to Arlington seemed ordinary. Morris and his friend stopped at a store in Edgebrook the night before, buying 2.223 magazines for their AR-15 rifle. Surveillance footage would later reveal them calmly making the purchase, as if they were preparing for a routine trip. Yet their destination and intentions were far from ordinary. When they arrived in Arlington early on May 4th, Morris parked his white 2008 Nissan Altima in the lot of the apartment complex where the boyfriend was believed to live. The car sat there for a while, unnoticed by most residents, but its presence would soon become a key detail in the unfolding tragedy. Inside one of the apartments, a witness who lived with the boyfriend noticed the unfamiliar car. She was already on edge, aware of the ongoing disputes between Morris and her housemate. As she moved about her morning routine, she couldn't have imagined the horror that was about to happen. Just then, Robert Cooley III, who was completely uninvolved in the conflict, walked across the lot of an apartment complex on Barden Green Drive in Arlington. He was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Unfortunately, his dreadlocks matched the vague description Morris had in his mind. From the parked Altima, Morris spotted Robert and made a devastating assumption. Gunshots were heard shattering the morning stillness. Witnesses reported hearing multiple shots before seeing Robert collapse to the ground, just as the Altima quickly sped away. As neighbors rushed out of their homes drawn by the sound of gunfire, they found Robert lying in the parking lot, motionless and bleeding. Someone immediately called 911, and emergency responders arrived quickly. Paramedics worked desperately to stabilize Robert. Though he was rushed to the hospital, the wounds were too fatal. Soon, Robert's neighborhood was shocked by news of his death. As investigators began piecing together the puzzle, the details were as surprising as they were tragic. Indeed, Kendall Morris had driven hundreds of miles with the intent to kill. Detectives worked tirelessly, following leads and interviewing witnesses. The surveillance footage from Edgebrook showed Morris and his friend buying ammunition, a critical piece of evidence that linked them to the crime. Witnesses from the apartment complex described the white Altima and the gunshots. Slowly, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place.
And then you racially profiled a stupid description. If you want to be a hate-filled killer, you want to be a gangster, at least get the mark right. This man did nothing but live and make others happy. He was loved. And for what?
The tragedy of Robert Cooley's death weighed heavily on everyone who knew him. An exceptional athlete, a budding musician, and a loving son, Robert's life was full of promise. His family was left devastated, struggling to understand the loss of a young man whose future had been so bright.
Why does this even need to happen? It's bad enough we don't value human life. We can't pause and take a beat, will you?
Meanwhile, Kendall Morris's actions left behind a trail of destruction, not just for Robert's family, but for his own as well. What could drive a person to act with such anger and recklessness? Though the answers were because of jealousy and rage, they offered little solace to those left picking up the pieces. As the investigation began, the search for Morris intensified. Police traced his movements, using surveillance footage and witness accounts to close in on him. The white Nissan Altima became a key clue, leading law enforcement on a multi-county search. Eventually, Morris was located in Madisonville, over 100 miles away from Arlington. A Texas Department of Public Safety trooper spotted the Altima on I-45 and initiated a traffic stop. Inside the car, officers found the AR-15 rifle used in the shooting. Though Morris initially attempted to evade capture, he was eventually detained by local deputies near Spur 104. The arrest brought some relief to the community, but it couldn't undo the pain and loss caused by the senseless act of violence. For Robert's family, there were no words to describe the extent of their grief. This sad chain of events, starting from the drive fueled by anger, a mistaken identity, and a single moment of violence, all changed the lives of two families and an entire community forever. But even as the pieces of this heartbreaking story came together, one question lingered. How could something so senseless happen in the first place? As the dust settled over Arlington, the community struggled with the sad reality of Robert Cooley III's death. The weight of his loss was immeasurable, a promising young man cut down by a senseless act of violence. But the case was just beginning for the police. What happened that day wasn't random. The pieces of evidence were scattered, but detectives were determined to fit them together. The description Morris had of his target was ambiguous and ironic. A black man with dreadlocks in a neighborhood where almost all the men were black and with locks. It was this lack of precision that led him to make the fatal error of targeting Robert. The evidence against Morris began to pile up: witness testimonies, surveillance footage, and the discovery of the Altima. As the case went to court, new details emerged, painting a fuller picture of the events leading up to that tragic day. Prosecutors laid out the evidence: the ammunition purchase, the phone records showing Morris's aggressive phone call with his intended target, and the damning surveillance footage. But it wasn't just the physical evidence that shows the intensity of the moment. It was the emotional weight of the trial. Family members of both Robert Cooley and Kendall Morris sat on opposite sides of the courtroom. Their lives were now intertwined by tragedy. Prosecutors described how Morris's jealousy and rage had blinded him, driving him to commit an unthinkable act. They emphasized his premeditation, noting how Morris had driven over 250 miles with the sole intent of ending someone's life. As witnesses mounted the dock, the most heartbreaking testimony came from Robert's family. They spoke about his dreams, his love for music, and the void his death had left in their lives. Morris's defense team tried to counter the prosecution's case, suggesting that his actions, while reckless, were not premeditated. They argued that the shooting was a result of a misunderstanding gone horribly wrong, but the evidence was too overwhelming. When the jury returned with their verdict, the room was silent. He was guilty, no doubt. The court handed down a sentence of 27 years in prison to the 26-year-old Kendall Morris.
What? We're all at risk if that's the case.
Mhm. Yeah, and that is exactly why the sentence is as long as it is for this man, because he had all of that time to cool down. I mean, in law, A few seconds is enough to be the difference between first and second degree murder. It's enough to say that that's a reasonable cooling period where you could have, you know, changed your mind. I mean, this is an absurd amount of time to spend.
For Robert's family, Morris's sentencing was the justice they sought, even though it was a bittersweet one. No sentence could bring him back or undo the pain they felt every day.